I'm presenting today on behalf of a team of professionals and researchers who've been working together collaboratively, as we heard, to look at outcomes for preschoolers with autism who are receiving early intervention in inclusive versus autism-specific specialised segregated settings. So this is a very, the issue of disability and inclusion has been of long-standing debate, but I think this is getting increasingly relevant to the context of autism and the early childhood sector as well, as children are getting diagnosed at younger and younger ages, and therefore the question around whether children should be educated or have early intervention delivered within mainstream inclusive or specialised autism-specific settings is really growing into this space. And so the things that we're considering here are aspects of sort of human rights around the least restrictive settings for people with disabilities to be participating in society. So in this context, having their early intervention. I think alongside this, though, is a growing appreciation or call in the research for co-production of research. So that's the genuine participation of the autistic community, so people with autism, and the autism community, so that is other stakeholders, so professionals working in that space, to actually co-produce research. So to work together to identify research questions, develop research studies, implement those studies and interpret the results. So I think you're all aware that on Bundoora campus here at La Trobe University, we have the Community Children's Centre, and so a lot of staff have their children attend there, students also. So this is a centre that has a number of mainstream rooms for typical children, and from 2010 has an autism-specific wing that has been built attached, which has 2 playrooms. So we have 2 autism-specific playrooms where every day 20 children with autism attend the centre on campus here at Bundoora and receive early intervention to try to support their skills growth before they transition into school later on. Trying to remember my next slide. So you probably didn't know that we have that aspect of the program on site here at La Trobe. And since 2010 to 2014, the team have developed, implemented and tested the evidence base for a particular type of intervention. So children with autism aren't just coming onto campus for long day care. They're coming here to get evidence-based early intervention as well as long day care, which allows parents to go back to work or study or have respite, whatever parents might like to do. What we've been interested in though, and this has really come from the educators in the service, is what would happen if we tried to actually have some of our children with autism placed in the mainstream rooms of the Children's Centre to get their intervention, rather than in a segregated autism-specific setting, which is very unique and somewhat artificial. And so from 2015, with support from the NDIA and the Department of Social Services, are you going to do the slides for me? So I'll have to do something like that. So that's the centre, you know where it is. Next one. That's what we've been doing. Carry on. Next one. So what we're doing is a randomised controlled trial to see whether children have similar or differential outcomes depending on which setting they're placed in, and to really test the acceptability of this inclusion, feasibility of upskilling mainstream early childhood educators to actually implement the intervention, so not just have the kids in their rooms, but actually do something helpful with them during the day, and the effectiveness of this for the children's own outcomes. So to date, we've invited 53 families to be involved in this study. 5 families have not been willing to be randomised, so actually have not been part of the study. I think that's interesting. And another 4 families have agreed but then withdrawn from the service shortly afterwards, which leaves us with 44 children who have been randomised into either our standard autism-specific playrooms, kind of our service as usual, or our mainstream playrooms at the Children's Centre or at a partner site also, which is not based on campus. And then all of these children have had an assessment at the start of the year and then approximately a year of intervention, and then we've assessed them again to see how they've gone in one or other of those settings. We're really excited because this paper just got accepted about 2 weeks ago, so the timing of this talk's really nice to start thinking about disseminating this study more widely. And so again, these are the questions that we've been asking of the data. So is this acceptable? So I think what our sort of consort diagram shows us is that for the large majority of families who have been eligible for the service, when we've asked them whether they might consider having their child placed in an inclusive playroom, they've been happy to flip a coin to see whether their child will be in inclusion or specialised segregation, autism-specific kind of service. Some families haven't, and that's an interesting question, but most families have found this a really acceptable thing to consider and do. Same with our staff and same with centre management. To have a trial like this happening in the centre, most of the staff and the management have been really on board with that idea. is it feasible? What we're asking here is, can we actually upskill staff who are mainstream early childhood educators to implement this evidence-based intervention with the kids in their rooms whilst doing everything else they're supposed to be doing for the other kids in their room? And so what we find in our autism-specific setting is really high rates of fidelity of delivery of the intervention, so 80% and above across the years. That's not surprising because we train them really carefully. What's great is that we're finding similar rates, so not quite so high, but increasing year on year, of the staff in the mainstream rooms as well, to deliver this intervention as you're supposed to do it, as well as doing everything else you're supposed to be doing for all of the children. We're also have looked at the quality of the teaching and learning environment using a measure called the STEW, which rates the aspects of the teaching and learning setting that are not about the intervention, they're just about good quality early education practices for children. And I guess what we want to check here is that what we're doing is not having a detrimental impact on the care that the kids in the mainstream rooms are getting. And so what we see is exactly that across our inclusive rooms, which are the lighter colour, and the specialised autism specific rooms, the darker colour, there's no difference in the overall quality of the teaching and learning environment for any of the children. And if we have a look over at the overall, a local benchmark that's been published places our rooms here on campus, whether they're autism specific or mainstream, above the national average. So what we're doing at our centre here is above the national average for quality care, and it's not differentiated depending on which setting it is in. So we think that what we're doing here is not having a negative impact on the experience of the mainstream kids, if you like to think of it that way. Finally, effectiveness. So are the kids in the two settings actually having the same outcomes on the basis of the intervention they're getting? And here I'll just show you the proximal intervention targets. So these are the things that really should be changing because of the intervention that we're giving these kids. We're looking at things like, are the children talking and communicating more across the year? Are they interacting more with other children, with adults across the year? Are they imitating, which is a foundational autism sort of challenge or skill that we want to teach these kids? And what we see, this is just one example graph here, is the kids in both groups are improving in all of these behaviours across the year. Importantly, there's no difference in the gains they're making depending on which setting they're in. So the kids who are getting the intervention in inclusion are making as much progress, as many gains, as the kids who are in our specialised autism-specific playrooms. So what we think we have is proof of concept that including preschoolers with autism in mainstream early childhood settings is acceptable, feasible for families, for the community. We can train mainstream early childhood educators to do this intervention, not just to include kids and sort of accommodate them in the classroom, but actually do intervention that's helping these kids to learn. And not detrimental to the rest of what's going on in the classroom. And we think it's also potentially as effective. So there's a lot more work for us to do, and we've got some clear plans already. We know we've got a small sample here, so 44 kids is not a lot, and kids with autism are so different from one another. So we need to do the study again with more kids to check that we get generalised effects across the population. And also we know that there are lots of implementation questions here, and so we have some plans, very concrete ones, to look at cost-benefit analysis. So it feels like having children in an inclusive setting might be more affordable because, you know, inclusive settings are everywhere, whereas there aren't very many of these autism-specific specialised services. We're actually not sure that's true, and so we want to do some proper cost-benefit modelling to look at that, particularly with the NDIS rolling out. Making a case for investing early for certain outcomes is really important in this space. We also want to look at this issue of staff training. So I've showed you some data that suggests that we can train early childhood educators to do this intervention. Actually, it's really hard work. We can do it, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of investment. And so we want to understand that better, and that links into the cost-benefit element also. And we want to do some formal evaluation of stakeholder experience and views. So this research so far has been a real partnership between early childhood educators and the community of autism service providers, but we really haven't engaged yet parents and families to understand what they want for their children with autism, what they think, why some of them didn't consent to being randomised and potentially getting an inclusive place because they definitely wanted the specialised service. We want to understand staff experiences, so the staff who've participated so far, but also staff in other centres that are not here on campus at La Trobe, to see what they think about potentially having kids with autism in their playrooms and how they would feel about that, how they would cope with training and support. and how management would feel about that as well. Again, I think we're in a particularly privileged place being on campus at a university where perhaps staff who are parents and researchers and management who are engaged in a research culture are particularly keen on this sort of thing. That might not be the case in other early childhood settings around the country, around the state, where we might want to roll this out ultimately. So lots more work to do. And we're really grateful for a Building Healthy Communities RFA Collaboration Ready grant that's going to help us to do some of this qualitative work next year. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, and also acknowledge that all the speakers today are women and the chair. I don't know what that says about socially inclusive research, but it doesn't happen often in academia, so yay us. So I'm going to talk about community engagement in HIV research at Arches, which is the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society here at La Trobe. We've got quite a well-established program in HIV social research, so we do a number of programs funded by a range of different organisations, but predominantly the Australian Health Department, to look at issues affecting people living with HIV. And in particular, a project we run is an ongoing study that monitors quality of life among people living with HIV to feed into the national HIV strategy. So I'm not necessarily going to talk about that. I actually wanted to talk about the nature of social inclusion and community engagement in HIV research, because it's actually it's a special case. In one respect, that makes it a gold standard, but it also makes it quite specific, and perhaps there are aspects of the HIV community that aren't easy to replicate for other issues or other communities. So I'll just give you a little bit of the history 101 of HIV in Australia. So as I'm sure you're aware, some of the first cases of HIV were diagnosed in the early 80s. So at that time, the situation with HIV was that no one knew what it was. There was not much the medical community could do if someone was diagnosed. So there was no treatment, certainly no cure. There's still not a cure. And people didn't necessarily, it was an almost certain death sentence for anyone who was diagnosed. At the same time, because it was mostly affecting gay men at that time in the Western world, which is where the first diagnoses were, there was a lot of homophobia, which meant that there was a lot of political inaction. People didn't necessarily care about gay men dying. And so it wasn't clear that there was going to be a strong government or political response to HIV. But what you did have was a very pre-organised gay and lesbian liberation movement at that time. So that had been sort of building through the 1970s. So you had a group of people who were likely to be very affected not only by a possible death sentence, but also by potentially a massive backlash, homophobic backlash, because people with gay men were being presented as, a risk, a threat to the rest of society. So these men, and I would say also a lot of women who were supporting them, became very engaged in the HIV response. So in Australia, the very first people who were running information and prevention campaigns were community activists, who then went on to set up community-based organisations that became sort of registered organisations. And so in those early days, it was actually HIV community activists who were sourcing and filtering all the new information about HIV. So a lot of the medical community were looking to the community, so doctors were getting their information about HIV from community activists. And in Australia, we also had quite a unique situation where the government was really responsive. So the Australian government at the time, which was the Hawke government in the early 80s, and Neil Blewett was the health minister, really decided to take a chance on funding community agencies. So they recognised that the community were best placed to run HIV prevention campaigns because it was a particular community, there was a particular sexual culture among gay men, and the government was just not set up to run information campaigns in that space. And luckily they knew it, and they knew that they'd probably get some flack for putting so much funding into community organisations when there wasn't a precedent for that. And there really wasn't at that time. It's much more, the model is much more well established now than it was then, but in the 80s it just wasn't done. So the government at the time set up what's now called the partnership approach to HIV. So literally you had community reps, you had government, you had doctors, and you had researchers sitting around the table to design HIV policy and public health responses. Completely unique at the time, but it also set up this precedent that community actors would be involved very heavily in research, and that included clinical research. So at the time you had a lot of drug trials happening for new HIV treatments. Because people were dying, they weren't necessarily patient with clinical trial protocols. So you had a lot of patient activists and community activists demanding involvement in ethics processes and also clinical trial procedures. And you had a small patient population. So it meant that if the community wasn't happy, they could really undermine a trial. They could share doses, halve doses to share with people on the placebo arm. They could withdraw from trials, or they could pill test. So researchers had to listen. And then that sort of spilled over into HIV social research. So communities started demanding better social research about the lived experiences of people living with HIV, a lot of funding. So the government set up some national HIV social research centres, of which Arches is one. And it came from communities. So from the very start in HIV, there's a strong expectation that you'll involve HIV community activists and, more importantly, people living with HIV in your research from go to woe. So from conception of the project all the way through to analysis and co-publishing. And it's really well established. So for us, that means, it's good for us because it means that there is an expectation that you'll do it, but there's also a lot of experienced and well-resourced community members who'll take that up and be involved in research. Although I just wanted to point out that this was fought for and it continues to be fought for. So there was this really kind of watershed moment in 1990 at the National AIDS Conference where people living with HIV stormed the stage and they coined that term, nothing about us without us, and they insisted on being involved in research and really took people to task, including social researchers, on not involving people living with HIV in research. So, and the sector continues to defend that principle. So it is fought for and it continues to be fought for, and occasionally it slips, and so you will get reminded by community if you're not doing it. So for us as researchers at Arches, what really that means is that our community engagement is an ongoing process. So those of us involved in the HIV social research program spend a lot of time being part of the HIV sector. So I go to a lot of AGMs, I go to a lot of meetings and conferences, I speak at forums, I provide information on request for people's funding submissions or advocacy reports. We draw on our data when people need it. So we consider our data a resource for the community sector and we promote it as such, and we do that as part of what we're funded to do by the Commonwealth, but also just part of what we see as our commitment as researchers, given that all our data is collected through people living with HIV. They have to take time to fill in our survey, so we try to make that data available. But it's also about, and I'll just say that happens at an organisational level. So Arches has focused on building our reputation as being trustworthy and good researchers and good community advocates as well, I guess. But also as individual researchers, we spend a lot of time. And I would say that it is a sort of community where you can't just walk in and demand someone participates in your study. You have to spend time. I've spent years actually going to a lot of the opening of an envelope really in the HIV sector to get to know people and be part of it. But I think also the attitude that you need to take, is this the right side? Yeah, is that it's valuable to us. So there really is a perspective that people living with HIV can bring to research that we wouldn't necessarily have. So for example, I've recently doing some work on community engagement in HIV cure clinical trials. So there's sort of a new thing in HIV cure research. And we were looking at the risks of participating in trials where people might have to go off their treatment for a while. So this would be people living with HIV, treatment that suppresses the virus. To be part of a cure trial, you'd have to go off it to see if the intervention's working. So that presents risks. And so we're trying to understand how people living with HIV would perceive that risk. And it turns out that it's very different to the way clinicians perceive that risk. So clinicians see a lot of people living with HIV as healthy because clinically they are healthy. And so therefore the risk is great. Whereas when we spoke to people living with HIV, they're saying, well, actually, I feel like my health's vulnerable. I'm actually quite concerned about my health into the future. I don't think I'm that healthy, subjectively. And so they saw their risk actually as lower because they didn't see they had as much to lose. I don't know if that's the best example, but it is one example of how actually all the way through the perspectives of people with lived experience really do value add to your research. And I find continually that if you actually go through to looking at results and co-publishing with community members, you get a much better quality of product 2 minutes left. So I'll just use one example. So we recently did this POSQUAL project, which was developing a short form measure of quality of life for people living with HIV. And it was a cool project, actually. It began because we were approached by several community organisations that wanted a good measure they could use for program evaluation, but also by a pharma company who wanted a measure to see the impact of HIV treatment on quality of life. So we were like, yep, and we wanted it because it helps us with our research to have a short measure that we can include in surveys. So everyone was interested, everyone pitched in money, so all the organisations and the pharma company pitched in money, and we did this process of developing this short form quality of life measure. And it was a really, actually, because it was a factor analysis, which is part stats and part art, like you have to sort of have a bit of interpretation there, everyone around the table was involved in interpreting sort of the categories that each item was eventually in, and the final look of that survey. And so it was a really good experience in terms of having lots of different voices and views in a data analysis process. And then we've co-written all the publications that have come out of that. And that's been so widely picked up, partly because it's had such a wide range of players who are interested in it. So it's currently being used in clinical settings and community settings. It's been translated into four languages and is being used internationally in research. And it's being used by the pharma company Vive on their on the little app they have, so for people to sort of self-monitor quality of life. So it's had this really great reach because it came from community and was so much part of community. And we're always being asked to talk not just about the outcome, but about the process of that, because it was good. It worked so effectively. Thanks.
It's all great. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. We've got a small research centre here at the Albury-Wodonga campus called the John Richards Centre for Rural Ageing Research. Irene, I think Blackberry at the moment, she is our chair, but she's away on holiday, so she asked me to do this presentation. So it's a little bit different. It's not on social inclusion exactly, but it's about loneliness, which sort of leads into some of the things people have been talking about. So I want to present today on an ARC linkage project, which I was a CI for. The aim of the study was to, first off, to identify the systems and supports that best support older people living in Australian rural communities. So here's the team. The research team were comprised of Jenny Warburton actually led this. Jenny's since left us, or she's working, she's gone back to Queensland to work, but Jenny led this project. Some of you might know Rachel Winterton, she worked on this, and myself. We had the University of Queensland, the University of Alberta in Canada, and our partners were the Department of Health and Human Services, Uniting Care Queensland, and Southwest Hospital and Health Services in Roma. So one of the things when we were talking with our partners about what they were interested in, the people from Canada actually said, older people, it's really important to be studying issues around loneliness as well as wellness. So while our central measure, I guess, was wellness, we also were interested in the extent that older people felt lonely living in rural communities. And we were wondering what contributed to that. So what were the predictors? How is it constructed by older people living in communities? And we used a mixed method study, but because of time, I'm only going to talk about the first couple of stages. So we had 2 or 3 stages. The first stage was a demographic profiling stage, and that was done by the University of Queensland, the demographers up there. And we were interested in looking at very diverse rural communities. We picked communities which we classify as SA2s, which are those that are no more than 10,000 people living in those communities. We wanted very diverse communities, so we looked at the CFA data. We looked at data in relation to assistance with daily living, tasks, those sorts of things, to see if we could come up with as diverse sort of populations as possible. I led the second stage, which was a quantitative survey, and we selected 6 case study sites for that to occur in. And then Rachel Winterton led the third stage, which was our qualitative surveys with some of the participants who agreed to be surveyed after the telephone interview. So just a little map of the study location where we conducted the study. There were 3 sites in Queensland and 3 in Victoria. And as you can see from that, one of the sites was down in Gippsland, one was up here in Mount Beauty Bright, in the Mount Beauty Bright area, the Alpine regions, and one was in the Wimmera Mallee region. And in Queensland, we looked at, because Roma were, Southwest Health were a partner, we decided we'd go to Roma, but that was because of its nature of being a mining town and very different. We went to Nanango, and we also Stanthorpe. So we did telephone interviews with 266 older people. As I said, they're from Bright, Mount Beauty, Yarriambiack, Yarram, Nanango, Stanthorpe and Roma. We managed to get our participation through what we call a community saturation approach, where we went to a lot of community information sessions. We went to Rotary, Provis, all those sorts of organisations, our key service providers. We went to what we call community champions to try and advertise the studies. And I've got a little picture there of Rachel and Turi, who was a research officer employed on the project, actually going out and drumming up numbers for the survey. Participants, they were sent a postcard and they elected in that way, and they also elected in via the telephone survey if they wanted to do a one-on-one survey, an in-depth questionnaire approach. So why did we choose loneliness? We know that loneliness is a distressing feeling, particularly for older people when they feel that the quality and the quantity of their relationships aren't meeting their social needs. And there's kind of two types of loneliness that the literature talks about. The first one's emotional loneliness, where there's an absence of intimate or close relationships. So somebody has lost a partner or a child or a parent, and there's that feeling of desolation and insecurity when that occurs. And then there's just that social loneliness, which is that feeling that you don't have a broader network, social network of friends or colleagues who can bring a sense of belonging and feeling in community. And older people's, we know that their networks shrink as they get older, so this is important. We also know from the literature that loneliness has a link to a lot of physical conditions: hypertension, cardiovascular disease, obesity, metabolic syndrome, increased mortality, but it also has an important link to mental health and depression, Alzheimer's, diminished executive control and so forth. So when we were thinking about what we would include in the survey, we looked at these as the key kind of areas we wanted to focus on. So social supports, mental health, physical health, absence of a partner or living alone, wellness, and socioeconomic variables, work, financial security and so forth. So the key measures of the studies were the Guillaume-Givald loneliness scale, which has 6 items and it measures loneliness. The Adams Perceived Wellness Scale, which has 6 dimensions: physical, spiritual, social, intellectual, emotional and psychological. The SF8 to measure both physical and mental health. We also looked at social networks. We asked people to name up to 15 people that they felt close to in their immediate network, so whether that be family, friends, neighbours. Some people talked about their home carers, their home helpers and so forth. And then we asked them to think about who does what for you in terms of their social supports. What sort of activities were they doing? And then we matched that, what sort of supports they were getting. We then matched that back to the person who did that. So we were able to get a good measure of the number of people in their social network and what they're actually doing for them. So in our regression model, we put into that the variables wellness, physical health, mental health, gender, age, marital status, living arrangements, financial capability, education, the size of their social network, their satisfaction with their social network, and the types of support they received. And from that, we were able to glean that satisfaction with the social network, so feeling like they had enough people, was the greatest explanatory variable for loneliness, followed by their sense of wellness, then by the support they received and their mental health. So I wasn't going to talk because of time about the qualitative data, but we did find some interesting things when we went to the interviews. But just to think about those key factors around satisfaction with social network, the support received, wellness and mental health. When we went and interviewed older people, that was also about agency. So how much control did they have in relation to visits from family, and a lot of them talked about children having moved away, particularly in rural areas, so they didn't see them as much as they wanted to. They had, because of some physical ailments, they hadn't been able to get out as much as they wanted to. They talked about life course, so not necessarily so much health, but where they were in the life course and what they had to sort of give up as they got older, and how that contributed to their feelings of loneliness. And then place, so being in a rural area was incredibly important in this study, where people talked about that social isolation brought on by sometimes living many kilometres away from their nearest friend or neighbour, but sometimes the opposite too, feeling extremely close in their neighbourhood because they felt they were part of a close-knit community. So that's all. I've sort of cut it down to the 10 minutes. I was going to talk a lot more about the qual findings, but hopefully I've made it within time.
Okay, yeah. So the title of my discussion today is Fear of Judgment, Physical Inactivity and Social Exclusion. So kind of flipping the idea of inclusion to understand how women in particular can be excluded from sport and physical activity opportunities and settings. So to give a bit of background in terms of the research itself, as part of the Centre for Sport and Social Impact, we conducted a study with VicHealth around their This Girl Can evaluation. We did an evaluation of their This Girl Can campaign. I don't know if people have seen it or saw it when it was live and active, but that was kind of around mid-March, and it ran until about June. So the objective from VicHealth's perspective was to kind of explore and demonstrate the kind of different types of women that can be active. So showing a diverse representation of women getting out there and being active, and maybe overcoming some of the fears they have around getting out there and doing different types of physical activity. So we kind of have been the evaluation partner for that campaign. The campaign itself, it ran in 2018. There's another couple of iterations for that to run as well. And we've done some kind of quantitative and qualitative research around that. So I'm not going to reflect on the quant side of things today. I'm just going to talk about the qualitative side to kind of explore in a bit more detail some of the women's experiences as part of that. So the quant component really focused on kind of analysing the outcomes and the impacts of the campaign over that duration, whereas the qualitative component is more exploratory to kind of dig down a little bit deeper into women's experiences with physical activity, particularly women that are currently inactive or not doing much activity. So in terms of the research itself, we conducted 40 in-depth exploratory interviews, and they were all with women aged 18 and over that had kind of self-identified as being physically inactive, and we ascertained that by asking them a one-item kind of activity measure question. So in the last kind of 7 days, on how many times have you done 30 minutes or more of physical activity that was enough to raise your breathing rate, and anyone that answered 0, we kind of explored as part of the research that we were doing. So really the interviews were designed to dig a little bit deeper into women's past experiences with physical activity and sport, and kind of active recreation, and kind of operate as a platform for their voices and their experiences. So rather than focusing on people that maybe had done activity in the past, it was a bit more focused on that kind of inactive segment of the population. And in terms of the kind of conceptualization and the lens for exploring this, in sport and physical activity literature, there's a lot of focus on kind of commonly cited in individual barriers to why people feel like they can't engage with activity. So, that might be time, cost, location, duration of activity. And in terms of the way you can view it, that is really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what actually constrains people from feeling like they can engage. And really what kind of lies underneath this are more social barriers, so a kind of fear of judgment, different socio-cultural norms, the kind of commonplace representations of physically active bodies that you see being active in sport settings, body image as well. So in terms of how this connects with exclusion and social inclusion, so looking through the lens of social inclusion, you can kind of explore some of the social mechanisms that kind of prevent women from engaging with activity. So rather than focusing on the tip of the iceberg, you're kind of delving down a little bit deeper into that. So turning the problem outward. So rather than, as an individual, you need to be more empowered or more confident to go out there and be active, focusing on some of the social norms or relations or processes that are happening with these opportunities or in these spaces that can prevent people from being active as well. So, from a lot of the women's reflections in regards to their physical activity, they did, and I'm not talking obviously about all women and saying that they're all excluded from activity, but obviously in regard to this particular subset of the population, they did feel excluded from accessing physical activity opportunities or different physical activity, sport and recreation settings. And it was these social processes and nuances around those that actually stopped them from engaging. So through this lens, you can focus a little bit more on, what are the socio-cultural norms attached to physical activity and sport? What are the relational factors that are happening across different spaces and in different contexts? And what are some of the structural factors as well that can inhibit people's engagement? So not just focusing on you as an individual getting out there and overcoming barriers, but also focusing on, what are the underlying social currents and processes and relations that can stop people feeling like they don't want to engage or can't engage with physical activity, or you don't feel comfortable in different sport and physical activity settings. So to kind of highlight this in relation to a specific example, I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of physical activity spaces, so settings or contexts where you would go to be active, whether that's the gym or maybe at a sports club or maybe out for a run, wherever that might be, the different spaces that can moderate people's sense of belonging or sense that they can access those spaces. And again, connected to the idea of different socio-cultural norms, understanding the norms that circulate in these spaces, it can make people feel like they're not part of that space or aren't included or are excluded from that space as well. So a lot of the time, in the interviews with the women that I was talking to, it was, well, have you been active, or when was the last time you were active? And it was kind of like, I kind of joined the gym and then I went along once and it just wasn't really for me. And I think a lot of people think, well, if you're going to get active, go to the gym. And really, it's kind of the worst place to go if you're a kind of inactive person. So in that space, it's the norms, it's the etiquette, it's the social expectations and the mechanisms that govern that space that actually exclude people. It's not you as an individual not being motivated or not being confident. It's those underlying social governance mechanisms and processes that need to be explored and kind of represented that can inhibit people's engagement. So, for instance, if you're going into a spin class, it's, well, where do I put my towel? Where do I put my drinks bottle? Everyone's talking to each other. Everyone knows the instructor. What do I do with the bike? And in reality, it's all these different norms and the etiquette in that space that can actually stop you wanting to go there and feeling comfortable. And it was quite apparent that in different settings, there was a sense really of what sort of people belonged. And a lot of the women that I talked to didn't really feel a sense of belonging in these contexts. So they didn't identify with being an active person. It's kind of, well, what is an active person? And I think there's quite a defined normalisation within society around what active people look like, what they wear, where they go to be active. And a lot of people didn't feel that sense of belonging. So they were excluded from these sorts of opportunities and these spaces as well. So that sense of not belonging was, derived from what different bodies look like, what bodies should look like when they're active. They shouldn't be jiggly. They should be all, looking nice and tanned and toned, and a lot of people didn't feel comfortable putting themselves out there and making themselves vulnerable in different situations. So again, it's the body types in certain contexts, the clothing, the norms, the etiquette that people didn't really understand, and they didn't feel comfortable to put themselves in those sorts of situations. And there's just a kind of quote there to highlight that. So in terms of what this means, in the kind of health and physical activity literature, there's a lot of onus on individual responsibility for getting out there and being active, and taking personal responsibility. So if you're not active, or if you're not engaged in an activity, it's kind of a fault of you, rather than maybe trying to turn that problem, so to speak, outward, to understand, maybe some of the social processes and practices and relations that are happening in different contexts and different situations might actually inhibit people's access to these spaces and to these opportunities as well. So, as I mentioned before, it was obviously a distinct subset of the female population that we talked to, but equally, that could apply to anyone really, in terms of how they feel like they might be excluded and not included in these sorts of opportunities. So, it's important to move away from the notion that it's not just about trying to, adjust people's individual behaviours, but also recognising we need to disrupt the norms around activity, physical activity spaces, and kind of make people feel a sense of comfort and belonging in those sorts of spaces, to actually kind of help people to be more active and engage if they want to in those sorts of opportunities as well. So I think that's kind of, in terms of what that means for the campaign. Obviously we're working with Vic Health to kind of feed some of these insights back, and hopefully that will inform kind of future iterations in terms of what work can be done, not just in a kind of broad campaign, but also on the ground as well, to start to kind of challenge the normalisation of the gym space, or of different exercise classes as well, to make people feel like they are equally able to go and access those opportunities and those spaces. And that's me. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm a PhD candidate and research officer at the Living with Disability Research Centre, or the LIDS Centre as we're affectionately known. Today I'm going to update you on a program of collaborative research we've been doing around the electoral participation of people with cognitive disability. A note on the terminology: when I use the term cognitive disability, I'm in this case speaking of people with intellectual disability and acquired brain injury. So just so you know what I'm talking about. So you might be thinking, why are we talking about voting participation in a social inclusion lunchtime session? And I will say to that, in my 10-minute answer, that political inclusion is one aspect of social inclusion, a broader sense of social inclusion. And one of the main ways that people are included politically in our society is through voting. So that's the short answer. We started this process by looking at the empirical research that's been done, and we found that there hasn't been much, and there hasn't been much at all done in Australia. And this is significant because we have a bit of a different democracy to where other research has been done. We've got compulsory voting, which changes many things. So we thought it was time to look into this. So we embarked on a program of research aiming to investigate the strategies that are effective in supporting people with cognitive disability to participate in elections. So there are a few strands to the work, and we're working with a number of organisations on the project. I was going to talk a bit about that process, but I won't, because time is slipping away. But we partnered with Inclusion Melbourne, who are a disability support provider in Melbourne, and they do a lot of work around social inclusion. We partnered with the Victorian Electoral Commission, which is the statutory body that runs elections, Victorian elections. They've done a lot of work around disability inclusion more broadly, but not so much around inclusion of people with cognitive disability, so they were very keen to do some more work in that area. And a number of other electoral commissions came on board through the process. And then the Traffic Accident Commission, or the TAC, who I'm very grateful for this week after getting whiplash last week, are also supporting Inclusion Melbourne's work, so we've been working with them. All right, so there are 4 strands to the work, and 1 is completed, so I'm going to talk mainly about this one, strand 1. The aim of this was really to get the lay of the land, and in lieu of a body of research related to this context. So we explored what the factors are that obstruct and facilitate voting, particularly for people with intellectual disability for this strand. And also what are the strategies that support their participation in voting. We did this using an action research approach. There were various phases. Each phase fed into practice, and in turn we received feedback from people on the ground, and that fed into our research. We did focus groups with people with intellectual disability. We did an online survey with staff, and we had some very interesting findings. Among staff, we found that there was a lot of goodwill, everybody almost was on board that every person with an intellectual disability has the right to have a say in who's representing them in government. But there wasn't a lot of action. So few staff had experiences supporting people to vote, and few knew of any voting initiatives that were being implemented in their organisations. There was also a lot of uncertainty about how or even if they should be the ones providing that support or encouragement. But people with intellectual disability said some very different things. So they saw voting as a collective activity you did with others in community spaces. It was something, there were very diverse political perspectives and interests. There was also a range of different attitudes towards the state of democracy in Australia, from interested and enthusiastic and eager, right through to very, very disgruntled with the state of politics and how electoral politics plays out. Voting was seen as a hard thing to do. There were many obstacles. Voting materials were hard to read and understand. It was stressful. People felt unprepared and unsupported. However, people felt that encouragement and support from others, often family, but also disability support staff and electoral officials, was key to their active participation. And this support wasn't seen as something that was problematic. So we took these findings and workshopped them with a stakeholder committee, including representatives from across the disability sector and people with intellectual disability, and came up with an initiative to be implemented by the VEC in the lead up to the Victorian state election in November. And that's where strand 2 comes in, which we're in the process of. So I'll have to get back to you on the findings. But basically, the VEC are implementing a pilot initiative that's aiming to empower, I guess, people from senior management of organisations right through to direct staff, and then working with people with intellectual disability as well around, for staff, appropriate support and what their role is, and then for people with intellectual disability about the process and encouraging people to get involved. So we're going to evaluate this and see if it has an effect on turnout in that population. The VEC is doing this with 2 organisations, one in metropolitan Melbourne and one in regional Victoria. Strand 3 is with Inclusion Melbourne. So they're taking a bit of a different approach to addressing some of the challenges experienced that came out in our research. The aim of their work is to increase or support political awareness and remove some of the barriers to the information that helps to make informed decisions when it comes to the ballot. So, for example, participants said that news, current affairs and campaign material was inaccessible, really. So they've developed an online resource that translates, in particular, campaign material into easy English. So I've got the web address up there if anyone thinks that might be useful for your decision-making process in November. But yeah, we're in the process of evaluating that as well. And then last, strand 4, the TAC have been working with Inclusion Melbourne to to expand the audience of this website to people with acquired brain injury. So some people at LIDS are acting as subject matter experts on that. So that's what we're doing. More to report in the future. And you can look out for the outputs, which will be a couple of reports on the 2 evaluations and the action research project. And maybe a PhD. Well, hopefully a PhD in a couple of years. All right, thanks.